Welcome to Theological Dialogues, the podcast where we dive deep into matters of faith, spirituality, and theology through the lens of Princeton Theological Seminary. This podcast is co-sponsored by the Center for Asian American Christianity. My name is Dr. David Chao. I direct the Center for Asian American Christianity here at Princeton Seminary. And today we have my colleague, friend, and guest, Dr. Jonathan Tran, who is Associate Dean for Faculty and Associate Professor of Theology and Great Texts at the Honors College, Baylor University. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dr. Chao. It's an honor to be on.
You and I have spoken quite a bit about Asian Americans and the spirit of racial capitalism, and I'm really glad that we have a chance to catch up since it was published, I think it's late 2021, early 2022. It's been a while since it's been published. I'm curious, what are some of the conversations it's sparked?
Well, I mean, you were on the ground floor of this book and its conceptualization 4 or 5 years ago, I guess. And it was at a point when I was thinking a lot of how we thought about these questions in the context of American theology, American Christian theology. And so the book, for those who have seen it or know anything about it, pushes uphill on a number of things. So I wrote the book in some amount of fear and trembling, not knowing whether it would be read, or if read, believed, whether it would make much traction within the kind of prevailing winds at the time. So in that sense, I've been very surprised, even somewhat shocked by its reception, in some quarters, appreciation for the arguments and the conversations that it's been a part of and initiated. So very, very surprised by how well it's been taken and the ways it's initiated new conversations in American theology.
That's great. Let's chat a little bit about the main argument of the book that explains race in terms of racial capitalism. For our viewers who may be churchgoers, lay leaders who may not have PhDs, what does this mean? And why did you pursue this explanatory strategy?
Yeah, so I think it's a commonplace to refer to racism as systemic, to talk about racism as a kind of systematic problem. I think in some ways we have a handle on what we mean when we talk about racism as systemic. In other ways, I'm not sure we do, or we do very well in Christian theology. Invariably, it ends up being a rather, personalist account. And it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine that doesn't come in some ways from the kind of strong individualist or personalist view of Christianity generally. So, in the same way that we think about sin and holiness on largely personal terms, I think we tend to think about sin, the sin of racism, in largely personalist terms or individual terms, all the while talking about it systematically or systemically, using the term systemic racism, or saying racism is a systematic problem, which suggests to me that we haven't quite come to terms with what it means to talk about systems or things as being systematic. And here I mean the interplay between individuals and the context that they live in, that produce their lives and their imaginations, and how they navigate the world and their moral imaginations and these kinds of things. But also, this is especially prevalent in your work and the work of, say, Princeton Seminary and Princeton University philosophy and moral philosophy and theory, is the relationship between how systems of concepts work. That is, how we speak about the world and how our speech is integrated and part and parcel with the world. Again, we tend to give lip service to the idea that these are systemic realities, but invariably begin and then come back to a rather personalist account. And the way I've tended to describe it is, going back to the analogy of how we think about sin, I think we tend to think about sin and Christianity, how we think about the evangelical retreat, it's all about individual stuff. And then the kind of come to Jesus moment is a come to Jesus individual moment. I come to Jesus. And then, at the end of the retreat, at these evangelical retreats, then we go back to a world of systems, and the individual stuff really makes no connection with it. So I think part of the discovery of what the book tries to discover is that the individual and its disconnect from the system, even though we talk about the systems, that disconnect itself is indicative of the problem. That we can't quite make the leap over to the systemic from the personal is itself part of it, because what it allows us to do then is to talk about racism systematically or systemically, all the while holding on to an individual affair that allows the systems to continue. That seems like not simply a kind of reality when it comes to racism and anti-racism. It seems like a typical American phenomenon, an inability to get out of our individual selves.
That's really helpful to situate how the concepts of race work within systems of racial capitalism. And I think you're going to put some flesh on this concept of racial capitalism as I direct us towards your two major case studies of the Delta Chinese and Redeemer Community Church that structure the two halves of the book. But before we get to the case studies, a quick word, if possible, on ethnography, because you use interviews and ethnography for theological and ethical ends. And I think there's more traction here amongst theologians and ethicists to draw upon the tools of anthropology and sociology to make theological claims. So how does ethnography help you do that in your book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, especially as a theologian? Say more about this methodological approach of using ethnography for theological ends.
Sure. So let me flesh out the account of racial capitalism and why ethnography is especially well suited to help us come to terms with it. So in the individualist or personalist account, racism is fundamentally an individual affair. It exists, largely between the ears. I am possessed of bad ideas or thoughts about other people. And these bad ideas or thoughts, these prejudices or stereotypes, or what have you, lead to kinds of behaviors and negative problematic outcomes. Sometimes this rises to the level of systems, say how healthcare is accessed or not accessed, or who gets education and these kinds of things. In this account, then, if that's what racism is, this individual thing, and the anti-racism is, the implication is pretty obvious. That is, you try to correct the bad source material. You submit people to diversity trainings, and hopefully they start thinking better things about other people and this kind of thing. There's usually a picture that goes with this. It's oftentimes the picture of, say, the racist redlining mortgage worker. She doesn't like, say, Black people. And so she scours through the applications for real estate mortgages and then circles the people she doesn't like, those with, say, Black sounding names, or we circle on maps where Black people should live. This is a powerful and often compelling picture of racism. I just don't think it's particularly accurate. So what racial capitalism then names is a world in which race plays always a systemic role. It's always a function of systematic realities related to housing or healthcare, education, employment, environment, so on and so forth. In this world, there's breathtaking, obvious inequalities and injustices, and the role of race is to justify and facilitate by justifying that society. That is, it's a kind of gaslighting move where you blame victims for their oppressions by citing their race as the justification or legitimation of why that system operates the way it is, right? So some people don't have access to housing, not because we live in an unequal system of housing, but because they're brown or yellow or what have you. So the race is an ideological justification on top of what is a material inequality, an ongoing systemic reality. So what the system is the way these things operate all together, the way housing works in relationship to class, to employment, to race, to history, the present, the past, the future. These are all systems where these concepts cohere with one another and inform each other in these kinds of unending feedback loops. So the reason ethnography then is important is to look at in a very detailed, textured way the way these things operate on individuals. In some ways, if the story I tell is right, it requires something at least as broad sweeping as an ethnography, a mixed method approach where we can try to see from very different angles and perspectives embedded in stories of individuals, their communities, and their wider networks, their larger ecologies. And so ethnography is especially adept to this layering effect. The best of ethnography is to try to be as attentive as possible, not simply to the individual story or the collective story, but the way the collective and the individual work in these kinds of systems. So I knew that my argument, insofar as my earlier comment was correct, that I was pushing uphill, that most people didn't tend to think this way. I knew I needed to have really good empirical evidence, very compelling, textured, granular stories about the operations of racial capitalism. And so it was necessarily an ethnographic story. If what we mean by ethnographic is it's embedded in human lives.
That's so helpful. Thank you, Jonathan. So let's pivot now to the first case study of the Delta Chinese that structures the first half of the book. And maybe you can lay out for us some of the main features of how the Delta Chinese operate within a racial capitalist system, and specifically how their Christian faith also operates. So you and I are theologians. We're interested in how theology is lived and works, especially within communities. And the Delta Chinese community is not well known. And so your book shining a light on them already does something. It centers Asian American life. But these are Christian or even Baptist Delta Chinese. So their faith and their involvement with church also textures their life within this racial capitalist system. So I'd love for you to tell our readers and our audience, spell out this story for us, for those who haven't read the book.
Okay, so let me again step back and then offer a broader perspective and then step into the story of the Delta Chinese. So what I've said so far really applies to race and racism generally, to racism and anti-racist realities broadly construed, not simply true for Asian Americans, but all raced people and the history of race as such. The way Asian Americans come into the conceptualization was they serve as I've called them, a conceptual miner's canary. That is, we can learn a lot about the larger racial story by examining how one racialized group fares within that story. And I think, as many Asian and Asian Americans know, is that it's not simply that we don't fare well in the story, we just don't figure in the story much at all. We either don't count or we're appropriated to various forms of what's called the white-black binary. We're either kind of honorary whites, white proximate, or, kind of forever foreigner whites, or we kind of beg a place in proximity to Blackness and tell our story in relationship, say, to anti-Blackness. And while those kinds of ways of thinking about them have some benefit, they yield some insights, they are hardly satisfying. They don't really capture the picture. I think the challenge for a lot of Asian and Asian Americans, and a lot of Asian and Asian American theorists have helped show this, is that it captures enough insight to be somewhat satisfying, and then we have to decide whether we're going to be satisfied with it or not. And the choice to not be satisfied with the terms that we receive and inherit come with significant political implications for our lives in the academy or in industries or in communities and neighborhoods. I think that's part of the challenge. So anyways, so really the point of the book is to tell the story of race broadly construed from a very specific perspective to return to those implications about race broadly construed. So while it's a book certainly about Asian Americans, it's a book about race generally in America. So that hopefully that helps as some background. So why the Delta Chinese are important to the larger argument I make is in this broader framework, right? So think about how in America we generally think about the races. It's what I call the hyperbolic picture of the races, the mad, raging racist, right? The Klan member who has the white bed sheets hidden underneath, somewhere in the house, and then takes them out and terrorizes people and burns crosses. This is the kind of hyperbolic picture of the races, or the sheriff unleashing his attack dogs on those poor protesters at the lunch counter, right? And again, it serves the individualist picture of racism. That is, we need to seek these people out. Sometimes they obviously expose themselves by being the raging racist that they are on social media or in neighborhoods or in communities, but more often it's hidden. So we really have to search them out. And then when we search them out, we need to, educate them or politely remove them from society or what have you. I don't think racism really works much like that. There's undoubtedly racists like that. I don't think they're particularly dangerous because we live in a society that has decided to ostracize them, to marginalize them, to identify them as problematic. I think the racism that we have to deal with is far more pervasive, far more subtle, and far more personal. That is, it's far more present in my life, your life, we as beneficiaries of this system. So that's where the Delta Chinese really tell the story, because the Delta Chinese, and I did a fair amount of research into the history of the Delta Chinese, but also the ongoing oral history and life of these folks, who are, there's still Delta Chinese in the Delta today, but really the ones that really at the core of my story are, mostly near the end of their life. And I was able to hear a lot of their stories. And none of these people are kind of raving lunatic racists. They're not Klan members. They don't own attack dogs. They don't say, as far as I know, use really awful language, really ugly terms. They're more like me. They are people who live in a society who kind of lean into a racist reality because it benefits us. They may not even have that many racist thoughts themselves. They may or may not, but that's not the driver for them. So the Delta Chinese is a story about Chinese immigrants who came to America in the middle of the 19th century into the early 20th century, and they came as cheap, exploitable labor. And these folks ended up all over America, but one of the places they ended up in the postbellum South was the Mississippi Delta, because the Mississippi Delta was probably the most powerful site of the most powerful economy in the world. That is an economy run by cotton and the textile industry. And this was entirely built on enslaved Black labor. So once emancipation happens, then the planters, the plantation owners in the South need new laborers, and they need them cheap, if possible, enslavable, if not indenturable. And that's what they got. They got indentured labor from China, and they brought Chinese folks over to America. And what happened with these folks is they couldn't, they didn't survive in the chattels, the attempt to redo chattel. So they ended up in the South, and eventually they opened up these supermarkets. And the nature of the supermarket was to create industry where no industry was had. That is, grocery stores for newly enslaved, new forms of Jim Crow enslavement of Black Americans. And so they opened grocery stores, on the one hand, of great benefit to these folks because white people wouldn't serve them. On the other hand, clearly exploitative of these communities and these neighbors. They saw a market need. They saw gaps in the local economy, and they exploited those gaps. They inhabited them, and then they became, they generated a fair amount of wealth. At one point, the highest per capita wealth income of Asian Americans in the country. And by, to get to your other question, the highest per capita incidence of Christianity. So they're very Christian, very wealthy, and they made money off of their Black neighbors by exploiting a gap within a political economy. None of these people are raving racist lunatics. They're rather like us. They inhabit parts of the political economy, what I call aftermarkets, and they make money off of them. But these aftermarkets are entirely structured into a racist and racial heritage and history. They exist exactly for that reason. On the face of it, it would look like they're just good entrepreneurs until you realize the conditions through which the entrepreneurial opportunity arises. And that is the structure of ongoing forms of inequality. What racial capitalism is the inhabitation of systems of inequality that have not been redressed, therefore continue to perpetuate themselves in time. And what a racial capitalist is a person who figures out how to make money off of that, with no interest at all in addressing inequalities, in fact, ever dependent on the inequalities in order to exploit them.
So the capitalism piece in the Delta Chinese case is about maximizing profit through limited resources, and these resources in this case are the stores that offer food and materials needed to live. The customers are Black, the store managers or owners are Chinese. And so the racial part of the racial capitalism is the Chinese stand to benefit from this kind of captive market of Black customers. Is that how racial capitalism?
Yeah, well, the racial, it's a really good question. The racial is the present context is that one. The past is the history of white domination of Black bodies and lands, and prior to that, the exploitation of indigenous peoples, First Nation societies, right? And so it's racial all the way through. And the exploitation is specifically the exploitation of inequalities made possible by racial histories. So in a sense, it's racial through and through. It just depends at what moment in the story you pick up which racial personas are evident and present.
So that's a really helpful analysis of racial capitalism working in a particular region, time, and place with the Mississippi Delta Chinese. Layer in the role of the Christian church, how this entered into Delta Chinese life, and how Christian faith, what did it do? Did it do anything? Like, did it raise consciousness about exploitation, about political economy, or not? And why do you think it did or did not?
Yeah, well, let me give you a couple other examples just to kind of fill out the picture, and then come back to the question of your really good question about what the Christianity was doing or not doing. So other examples that are going to be familiar to Asian and Asian American folks will certainly be the Korean liquor store in certain kinds of communities in America, or wig shops. Right. These are all in the instances where migrant folks come and land and pursue opportunities of wealth extraction. And oftentimes they're raced in the sense that, on the one hand, the extracted population is usually Black or brown, and these histories, the history of the production of their inequality over time, is what sets up the opportunity. It's also racial in that the migrant laborers are racialized as migrants. That is, they're not given fair footing, equal footing in other parts of the economy. So they make a beeline oftentimes, as Korean Americans have often to, or say South Asians to certain parts of the motel industry in America, right? So these are kinds of ethnically developed enclaves and pathways into America that where the opportunities, specifically the exploitation of ongoing inequalities produced in the past. Now, the people doing the exploiting very often had nothing to do with the creation of the inequality, but they have everything to do with its perpetuation because they're exploiting it. The point isn't to generate wealth, to redistribute income, to correct the inequalities. The point is to extract wealth for the migrant population away from the exploited population. So liquor stores is a really strong case in point, and there's been a fair amount of very good study along these lines. The payday loan industry is another case in point. It's a banking industry where you exploit people by way of kind of parasitic, predatory loan schemes and this kind of thing. It's the same idea. So I said earlier that these Delta Chinese were not only wealthy, and they had not only stumbled upon an extraordinary aftermarket of opportunity and exploitation, but they're also, very, very, very Christian. So what did the Christianity have to do with it? That's one of the driving questions when I looked at the history. And one of the things that was really interesting in doing the research was asking these folks and digging up the archival research, how much they had thought about racism, how much they had thought about themselves as racist, how much they had thought of themselves in participation to white and Black communities. And their own kinds of racial terms that they used, whether ugly or not ugly. And one of the things that was really quite extraordinary is how seldomly they ever talked about racism. Many of them couldn't be convinced that there was a lot of racism. They certainly saw that Black people lived unequal lives in the South, in the Delta. That was readily apparent, but it never had anything to do with the Christianity. Many of them said they never, ever heard a sermon about race. And it's not like they went to churches. They almost all went to white churches, or eventually Chinese migrant churches. It's not like they heard a sermon on how to be racist or that racism is a good idea. It's just that they never heard anything about it at all. And this to me is, in fact, to me is even more frightening and nefarious. It's one thing if a church readily preaches a racist gospel. It's quite another when they leave it in such a way that suggests that God has nothing to say about racism. God neither wants you to be a racist or an anti-racist. It allows a whole sphere of the human life to remain out of touch with the Christianity. That the Christianity matters here and the political economy matters there, and never shall the two meet. It basically gives a complete pass on the one. Right. It allows your left hand not to know what your right hand is doing, even though your right hand is doing it most of the day, every day of the week. Your whole life depends on what your right hand is doing. And that was just the common picture. What it suggested was that Christianity gave a de facto endorsement of the system of inequality that brought the Chinese to the South and helped make them Christian. And it gave a default endorsement to their ongoing lives of exploitation. So that was the most shocking thing, was just the relative absence of it. There's been a lot of theologies that have tried to tie up the explicit connections between racism and Christian theology. Over time, I found those to be less convincing, those stories. The more powerful story was the one I know is as familiar in American Christian life. That is the utter separation of these questions.
Right. So this first case study of the Delta Chinese and the separation of these issues of Christian faith and theology on the one hand, and church life and political economy, specifically of racial capitalism exploiting Black neighbors by the Delta Chinese. And then in the second case study, framing the second half of the book, we're going to imagine otherwise. We're going to see an alternative vision of how Asian American Christians engage with racial capitalist systems. So we're going to pivot there, but before we do, say a little bit more about the kind of formation, therefore, that is going on with the Delta Chinese, given the absence of recognition, the absence of self-consciousness regarding systems, race, money. Because I imagine for some of our faith leaders, pastors, campus staff workers who are listening to this podcast, they do a lot of discipleship. Discipleship is kind of a major ministry for shaping Christians to be more faithful followers of Jesus Christ. So say a little bit more about what happens in our formation of followers of Jesus in cases and scenarios like the Delta Chinese.
One of the things I pick up in the book is, as you know, a topic that's readily bandied about in Asian American studies circles, and that is the model minority myth. And in those circles, it's often, what's worried about was whether it's an accurate depiction of Asian Americans. That is, we're all successful and therefore offer a model for Asian American or minority life in America. One of the things I say in the book is that's not, to me, the most dangerous problem of the model minority myth. The model minority myth's problem don't have to do with whether it's accurate empirically or not. The problem with the model minority myth is how tempting it is. It draws you into a picture of Christian life as an Asian American that has everything to do with worldly success, as if Jesus never had anything to say about worldly success, especially when that success comes, as it necessarily does in the American context, by way of perpetuating injustice. So, and I actually learned this stuff in university, and it's always been critical to how I think theologically, especially as it's been informed by liberationist thought. Right? Jesus has a lot to say about money. We keep on forgetting that, which is odd because as a country, it's hard for me to imagine we care about anything less than money. we care anything more than money. We are obsessed with money and wealth in this country, and Asian Americans are pulled into this story repeatedly, partly because of the migration histories that our parents may tell us, that we came to America for this reason. They don't usually say money, but that's really what they mean. They mean success on financial material terms, often tied to made possible by elite forms of education. So, so in that case, you would think that, Jesus doesn't have many good things to say about money. He has a lot of bad things to say about money, as does all of Scripture, that money is, as Jesus says, really the great challenger to God as God. The great challenger is mammon as God. As my very good friend and pastor, Malcolm Foley, has a book called The Anti-Greed Gospel. And Malcolm shows how at the heart of how Ida B. Wells understood the lynching campaign against Black men in America, it was entirely about racial capitalism. And so Christianity's always been at war with greed and capital. We just forget that because why? We're greedy, we're capitalists. So we've appropriated the gospel. We've bent the gospel. We've distorted it in a way that gives a pass to our greed and our capitalism, which is rather remarkable. If you read the Gospels, especially through the context of liberation theology, which I think everyone ought to. And so part of what being morally formed in the imagination of what Du Bois called industry, or just capital, or capitalism, or racial capitalism, is it does two things. It distorts your soul into participating in systems of violent injustice. And then it makes you think, it's both of these things. And then it makes you think that that's fine. That actually has nothing to do with the gospel. Such that if someone says to you, why are you living that way as a Christian? You can, in good faith, say something like, it has nothing to do with my Christianity. And that's the ultimate trick of the devil, to think that the devil doesn't exist, that the devil isn't playing a role, that you aren't absolutely possessed by this idol. And the challenge, I think, for us who work with young Asian Americans in churches or in universities is how much the model minority myth is just absolutely pushing this story. That, that's why you're here in university. That's why you're here in America, is to get wealthy. And Christianity really either has nothing to say about that, or it kind of gives you a positive green light. And such that if you get wealthy, your prayer isn't, God, forgive me for this wealth that is feeding me while starving millions of people around me. The prayer is something like, God, thanks for this wealth that you gave me, which is the ultimate justification of your wealth and the ultimate indictment of those who are not wealthy, as if they haven't been blessed by God like you have. So you see how the kind of story goes. It's kind of feedback loop that justifies and facilitates our lives.
So part of the takeaway from this first case study, and I'll kind of use some pointed language, of malformation, is when Sunday church worship doesn't touch Monday through Friday vocation work, right? It's like when we have this bifurcated existence of loving Jesus with all our heart, mind, and soul, but what about loving our neighbor Monday through Friday? When these are two, when they don't touch each other, that's when we can imagine that race and capitalism don't matter to the gospel.
That's right. And it's everything that occurs the rest of the week, right? That also makes that Sunday possible, and so, go back to the Delta Chinese, you can imagine someone saying, well, what's wrong with people exploiting, some opportunity? Isn't that what capitalism is? That gives you a sense of the diseased imagination, because it takes its point of comparison as the capitalist economy itself. It doesn't take as a point of comparison, say, Jesus' picture of the Good Samaritan, which is a very, very different political economy. Remember, then the Good Samaritan is a stand-in, a placeholder for Jesus' own very life of cross and resurrection. And so now you take the gospel as your point of reference, then exploiting opportunistically it takes on a very different flavor. But we don't take the gospel as the point of reference. We take our lives in America as the point of reference. And we often say, well, I may be rich and exploitative, but I'm not rich and exploitative like those people. And I'm always pointing up. Versus you might take the teaching of, say, Basil, the early church father, Irenaeus, these folks who, and this is carried on in Catholic social thought, who have a phrase, whenever there's someone's enjoying their wealth, the phrase is, but there are poor people. But there are poor people. Your moral responsibility, your moral point of reference is that, not the wealthy people that are somehow wealthier than you. Because in the same way that you can excuse the Delta Chinese, you may say, well, look, I'm just working on some AI right now, right? Some artificial intelligence, and this new kind of machine learning that generates these new ideas, and that has nothing to do with Jesus. Well, it might, because you may be producing a machine that really takes humans out of the equation and human labor, which you've already exploited, and now you're just going to erase from the story. Now, interestingly, a lot of Asian American, obviously I'm dealing with a stereotype here, but a lot of Asian Americans in the computer science industry are about to learn this, because they were taught, one, that if you became a computer scientist or a computer engineer, you would achieve all the model minority wealth that you wanted while your parents came to America. But almost all those jobs are about to go by the wayside, because they're going to be replaced very quickly by AI machines. They're going to quickly learn that they were always exploited labor. They just thought they were on the better side of exploited labor. Like those parts of America that don't have access to computer science engineering. So you may say, well, what does this have to do with Jesus? I want to say it has everything to do with Jesus. And the fact that we are even asking that question itself is indication of the great problem of Christian discipleship.
I really appreciate, Jonathan, how you're indexing our Monday through Friday work lives to the gospel as opposed to the capitalist system. Right there, that shift of reference point to the kingdom of God, to the way of life Jesus has instructed and embodied for us, that strikes me as correct. You're helping us imagine otherwise within a racial capitalist system. Say more now about part two, the case of Redeemer Community Church and our friends like folks like Chi-Ming Chen, who came out of InterVarsity within the Stanford area. You know, you were referencing Silicon Valley just now. Say more about how part two of Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism is a challenge to the Asian American Christian community to imagine otherwise when it comes to discipleship, Christian faith, and racial capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, let me begin by kind of tying a loop to something earlier that we talked about. Once you begin to see racism as systemic in the ways that I've talked about, such that how you spend your money, where you educate your kids, what houses you buy or don't buy, how you imagine local taxation, that those are issues of Christian discipleship to which we're responsible, then you begin to see the utter convenience of the personalist account of racism, right? So if it's just the personalist account, these things all get a pass. And so the anti-racism that has been tied to things like diversity and personalist, individualist stories about racism and the raging hyperbolic races, you begin to see the utter convenience of those things. That the benefit of those things, you know, they're obviously incorrect, but why did they continue to exist for so long? Well, they again help facilitate, because we could always point to the races out there and the racism over there, rather than the races here and the racism that I'm participating in, insofar as I own a house in a certain neighborhood or educate my kids in certain ways that will make sure that the taxing code disenfranchises local political power and those kinds of things. So, so the second part of the book really is the story of how some Christians who are Asian American come to discover these things about the world, namely simply because they're open to discipleship, and how this counter formation then leads them on a very different path of life. So most of the stories I tell were of computer science students and electrical engineering students at Stanford and Berkeley, which are arguably the most elite private and public institutions in America, and certainly at the very top of the new economy around technology. And these students got into those schools by all the model minority hard work that you could dream of, right? One of the people I talk about, all four of the siblings went to Stanford, right? And you know, so again, you know, what are they drinking, kind of thing, right? And so these students, these people and their families had done everything for them to be model minority people, except for one thing they made a mistake with. They also raised these kids Christian. And whereas the Christianity usually would just endorse the Monday through Friday, right, exploitation, the Christianity did enough to fire the imagination of these kids when they got to university. And they happened to join InterVarsity groups at Berkeley and Stanford and other universities in the area, who believed two things at once. One, that Jesus was on the side of the poor. And two, that if you wanted more of Jesus, you better go where Jesus is, which is on the side of the poor. So rather than using their Stanford electrical engineering degrees to jump onto this, and remember, the technology boom was blowing up at this time. And these students had a first-class ticket to the top of that, right? Because they went
personal wealth. Like there was a check with their name on it at the end of graduation.
They just had it. They had to claim it and cash it. That's all they had to do. If you have an electrical engineering, if you have advanced degrees in electrical engineering from Cal or Stanford at this time, your ticket is punched. You just need to cash it and claim it, right? And so, but Jesus got in the way, largely by calling these students through InterVarsity's Oakland Urban Project, which helped them see the systemic nature of these things. Again, the systems on the one hand of injustice and sin, but the systems also of justice and mercy. And the most prominent story they learned in these InterVarsity groups wasn't simply the story of sin and injustice. The most prominent story they learned was that God is on the side of the poor. and you can get as much God as you can get by being in those places. That was the system that they needed to learn most. Not how evil the world is, but how good it is, and how much they wanted that goodness, that their lives felt incomplete without that goodness. And so, after school and graduate school, eventually these Christians found their way to a church that was fully committed to this picture of justice and mercy. And then they founded another church. And then over about 2 decades, they listened and learned from their neighbors. They were apprenticed by local Black church communities. They found out from their neighbors the things that their neighbors most needed is local businesses. So they started a software company. They redistributed money for local businesses. The other thing they learned from their neighbors is their neighbors wanted schools for their kids, schools that were secure, that were stable. And so they used money from the software company to create a school where kids can largely go for free and get a high level of education. And most importantly, they never saw themselves, and this was to me the most remarkable thing, they never saw themselves as doing something extraordinary. They never thought they were effectively ending racism, that they never saw themselves as effectively putting up a fight to resist racial capitalism. They saw themselves as called to the gospel, and they wanted to be faithful to their friends at church, and they wanted to be faithful to their neighbors. And they're people possessed of love, not because they were themselves deeply loving people, but because primarily they felt Jesus had loved them and loved them through friends, and they wanted to live lives of love. That to me is the most extraordinary thing, is that these people are living extraordinary lives, but they would never use those terms extraordinary. They would say we're ordinary people trying to be faithful to our friends and our families, and here we are. And they exist now going into their 3rd decade.
So discipleship in this second case study is no longer simply personalist. There is a personal relationship with Jesus of love, but Sunday has touched Monday through Friday in this case of discipleship and formation. Your example with education, so that happens, you send your kids to school Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The software company, Dayspring, that's a job you go to typically Monday through Friday. And the job stuff and education stuff was deeply connected to the Sunday worship stuff. That's part of what I'm hearing, that faith and systems that gap is beginning to be bridged. Is that right?
Yeah, the most systematic thing that we can know, and this ties the systems of justice and injustice to systematic theology, is a key insight from one of your heroes, Karl Barth. Karl Barth offered us the simple reminder: the week for Christians begins on Sunday. We don't work towards it. We don't earn it. We don't work hard and earn the weekend. The week for us begins in the rest that is the eternal life of Jesus, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Right? That is the beginning of the week. It orients and colors everything that comes after. And the week ends with Sunday. It begins with rest and ends with rest. The story of God's victory in Christ is the story that runs through everything about creation. It's not simply the story of Christians. It's the story of creation. It's the story of everything that is, insofar as it is at all, right? And so for these Christians, then the political economy, or what I call the divine economy, owing from, again, the early church, is simply living into the gospel that Christ has in fact won. And so the reason the Redeemer people live that way isn't because, as the adage of a certain view of the early church goes, they think that Jesus is going to come back any day now. And if Jesus is going to come back, you better not be caught dead with your HD television. Rather, you think the world's going to end. Rather, you think the world has ended. The new world has begun. Jesus has inaugurated the new kingdom, and the new kingdom looks like Redeemer Community Church, with its school and its neighborhood and its apprenticeship in the Black church, and it's following Jesus, to the underside of the empire, because that's where the emergence of this new world is showing itself. And you just want that stuff. You can't imagine your life any better than to live proximate to that stuff. Now, it looks exactly the opposite of the world's terms of success and wealth, but hey, you're pretty convinced. And so that's where you are.
I find the vision, especially through part two, of a kind of discipleship that brings together Sunday worship with Monday through Friday, the stuff of life, the quotidian. I find that extremely appealing personally. Like that really speaks volumes to me. And Jonathan, I think along with so many other Asian American Christians who have read your book, who have seen the faith and practice of Asian Americans given such rigorous theological and political analysis, it spoke to us volumes, because here finally was a theological text that we could see our stories belonging to or part of, right? So thank you for writing that book. Maybe a closing question. So now we've got these two case studies, Delta Chinese, Redeemer, Community Church. What explains the difference in these two case studies for how Asian American Christians are formed and the politics of their formation?
Yeah, it's a great question because, going to your point, the point of those stories, or any story, or any exemplification of moral goodness or moral badness, is to illuminate, or to fire the imagination. And so let's say you live a Delta Chinese like life. I want you to know that it's not that great of a life. Now, it sounds like it's great because you've generated a fair amount of wealth and you've exploited goods to your benefit, and et cetera, et cetera. But until you run up against the Redeemer folks, you're not going to know that wasn't that great of a life, because that's what the world had told you was the best life possible. It's the same thing. If you live a Redeemer-like life, but all around you see Delta Chinese-like Christians, you're going to think your life is pretty miserable. It's really hard, and you're going to chase after that other thing. Maybe that's a lot of what the migrant story is about. I want you to know that, I think that Jesus thinks it's an amazing life. It's the best life you could live. You're just not going to hear those cues from the world. You're going to have to pay pretty close attention to the gospel, as did those folks from Stanford and Berkeley did. So, what accounts for it? I mean, luck. It's just the contingency and fragility of goodness. One or the other of the Christians could have absolutely ended up in the other context and were formed the other way. The way we Christians talk about moral luck, of course, is providence, some account that God has chosen us and blessed us and broken us and given us in certain kinds of ways. And I don't ever want to say that there weren't amazing forms of faithfulness within the Delta Chinese. I'm sure, and in fact, I try to document the places there were. Just like I don't want to tell the story of Redeemer in a way that sets them up to fail, because there is also frailty and fragility there. Who knows? I guess is a question. If I get to heaven, you'll definitely be there, David. I may not be there, but if I get there, C.S. Lewis said, you ought to be surprised by three things. Who's there, who's not there, and that you're there. So I've tried to tell the story in one way that accounts for things in a certain way, but who knows if we're right? We'll see. What I do know is the Redeemer people have latched onto a picture of Jesus that is different than the model minority, but has given them a very amazing picture of what it means to be Asian American, where the Christianity does some serious work.
I feel that this podcast has stirred our imagination. This is a great place to end or put a pause and a bookmark on the current conversation, Jonathan. I want to thank you for your work that is so deeply humane and theological. I think this can be a rarity in today's theological scholarship that is for the church. So thank you for your scholarship, Jonathan. Thank you for your friendship. And thank you for this podcast conversation. I think it'll really be a tremendous resource for our audience out there.
Again, it's a real honor to be on with you.